Hello, I'm Tom Harmon in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. It's Friday, and that means it's time for Conversations with Great Minds. Tonight, we have economist and author Ian Fletcher. We'll discuss the disadvantages of free trade and its twisted history. Then, ready to rumble? My panel guests and I will debate the top stories of the week, including the political uproar in Wisconsin and the union-busting bill just signed by Governor Scott Walker. Then the corporate takeover we're seeing in Wisconsin, it really isn't all that new. In fact, it dates back more than 100 years with a controversial Supreme Court case. I'll tell that story to you in our Daily Take. For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by Ian Fletcher, an author who has his finger on the weak pulse of America's economy. Currently, Ian is the senior economist at the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Ian, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me on your show, Tom.
I'm very pleased to have you. I thought your book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, was extraordinary. I did a book review of it for BuzzFlash, as you probably know, on and I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about some of these issues. You have, you know, in addition to whatever academic background, you actually have some experience in the world of business and trade, as it were.
Well, let me tell you how I came to write the book. I was working a couple of years ago as an economist in private practice, consulting to mainly hedge funds, private equity, guys like that. And I started to get tired of helping guys who had, frankly, too much money make even more. And about the same time, I was becoming aware of developments in the academy that was making it possible to intellectually criticize free trade in a lot of ways that people have been doing on a purely practical level for some time. There was now a way to make this intellectually legitimate. So my wife said to me, if you don't write this book you're talking about, you're always going to wish you did. So yeah. The book is the result.
Yeah. By the academy, you mean within academic circles?
The criticism of free trade by political figures and folks in the real world has been a flashpoint for some time now, certainly since NAFTA. But academicians, economists with a capital E, have been telling us for a long time that free trade is a known scientific truth of economics. But that's changing. People are finally figuring out how to translate these criticisms of free trade into the abstruse mathematics that economists are prepared to consider real thinking. And I thought it was high time somebody told the general public about where that was going.
Well, and that's one of the things that I found so marvelous about your book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, is that anybody could read it and get it. I mean, it was just, it wasn't a book written like, you know, I slogged through Wealth of Nations. You know, Theory of Moral Sentiments was actually easier to read. You know, Adam Smith, both of them, you know, and David Ricardo's work and whatnot. In any case, let's just start out with some definitions. Free trade.
Well, free trade means that there are no barriers for buying and selling goods produced in one nation in another country. And in the United States, that means that our markets are open to the rest of the world. Now, the problem is when we use the term free trade, this actually covers a situation that's not quite like that. It means that our markets are open to the rest of the world, but the reverse is not the case, which is, of course, why we have such a trade deficit.
In other words, there's no such thing as free trade in the real world. Or is
On our side, there is. America's markets are pretty open to the rest of the world. U.S. tariffs are about 1.5% of the volume of our imports. So if you want to say our trade is 98.5% free, I can live with that. But the real problem is going the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned the word tariffs. Again, definitions. What is a tariff?
A tariff is just a tax that's collected on imported goods and services.
So would it be appropriate to say that, for example, for a long, long time in the United States, we said, you know, if there's $1 worth of labor made in a pair of shoes made in Connecticut, and 20 cents worth of labor on the same shoes made in China, or 40 cents worth of labor on the same shoes made in Mexico, when you import those shoes into the United States, we're going to hit you with an 80-cent tax if it's coming from China, or a 60-cent tax if it's coming from Mexico. So no matter where you make it, it's going to cost you the same, although it's not just labor, obviously, that tariffs are equalizing. and that the whole point of a tariff-based trade mechanism that Alexander Hamilton put into place in the United States in 1793 was to give a preference to domestic manufacturing. Is that a reasonable summary, and is it accurate?
Yes, you've put your finger on a very important point that's misunderstood by a lot of people. Despite the myth that America's economic heritage is free markets, free markets, free markets, in point of fact, for most of our history, the United States was a very deliberately tariff-protected economy. The Constitution itself says Congress has the power to levy a tariff. The Founding Fathers were protectionists.
Yeah, right from the very beginning. And the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in the George Washington administration, was the guy who, his report on manufactures in 1791, largely adopted by Congress by 1793. From the time of the founding of this country until more or less around the time of Reagan, actually, let me back that up a little bit. I know that for the first 100, 150 years of our country, tariffs were pretty much everything. In fact, my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, 100% of the cost of operating our federal government up until the time of the Civil War was income from tariffs. Some of it was interstate, but most of it was international. From the Civil War to World War I, 2/3 of the cost of running our government was tariffs. From World War I to World War II, a third of, and government got huge, still a third of government revenue was tariffs. Today, it's some tiny fraction of that. When and how did that collapse in the use of tariffs, both as a source of income for the government and as a way of protecting domestic manufacturers? When and how did that begin?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when I wrote my book, one of the questions I asked myself was, if we started out believing in tariffs and we don't believe in them today, at what point did we figure out they were bad, and what was it we discovered?
Right.
Now, what I found out is there is no such point, because in reality what happened is that the United States abandoned the protectionist philosophy of international trade in the wake of World War II as a political move. It was a bribe to the rest of the world to not go communist. We wanted to prop up the economies of foreign nations that were threatened by the Soviet Union at the time, places like Italy, Greece, Japan, and also tie them to dependence upon us, so that if the Italian government started getting cute with the communists, we'd say, okay, there go your shoe-wear exports. So it was a political move. There was never any point at which we suddenly realized, oh no, tariffs are a bad idea.
But during the Eisenhower administration, if my recollection, it's been a number of years since I did this math and wrote my own book that had a chapter about this in it. But my recollection is that during the Eisenhower years, average import tariffs in the United States were around 20% or in that neighborhood, and that they really didn't start dropping until after Nixon, or am I missing it?
Well, there's a number of shifts. If you look at the numbers, the big fundamental decision was made after World War II, when we not only cut our tariffs, but we removed various other barriers, and we applied various other policies, like, for example, the Marshall Plan to rebuild foreign industry so they have the ability to produce goods that they can export to us
kind of a reverse
in the
tariff.
first place. Right. And it's an understandable political decision at the time, but the reality is that by about 1960, Europe had recovered from World War II, Japan was well on the way to recovering, and the Soviet economic challenge to the world that had at one time seemed like a serious threat had pretty much petered out. So we really should have pulled back at that point, but we didn't. The policy had become entrenched thanks to special interests that were profiting from the opening of our market to the rest of the world. And there had also been a process of intellectual corruption in the economics profession in which people had started to actually believe in a policy which had only been adopted as a political expedient.
That's a really interesting point, because, you know, I mentioned Wealth of Nations. 1776, Adam Smith wrote that, and free traders today cite him, and yet that's not what I got out of reading his book, and certainly not out of Theory of Moral Sentiments. In fact, if anything, I think you could build a protectionist argument out of Wealth of Nations. Who were the intellectual? Are we talking about like von Mises and Hayek and Friedman? I mean, is that where it started, or where did this begin? This idea that free trade was a good idea in the United States, this religion almost.
Well, the thing you have to understand is that even in the time when the United States was a protectionist economy, as policy. The academy was split on the question.
The academic world.
Yeah. And so what happened after World War II is you had a much older tradition, such as it's called the American principles in political economy, the American school of political economy, which was alive and kicking in, say, Abraham Lincoln's time. It was well known to educated people in this country. These guys kind of died out under the immediate pressure of the political need to indoctrinate everybody in favor of free trade. And you also had various other trends in the discipline of economics which sound like they're not too important, but things like the ultra-mathematization of economics, which didn't used to be a hyper-mathematical discipline, it creates a bias in favor of free trade thinking, the same reason it created a bias in favor of all kinds of pure free market thinking, because it's much easier to build mathematical models of a free market, free trade version of the world, because you assume that markets are perfect, then you know exactly what's going to happen, it's all for the best. And so things that don't seem important, like an obsession with mathematization, created incredibly strong pressure inside the ivory tower that pushed things in the free market, free trade direction.
That's fascinating. What is comparative advantage?
Okay. The theory of comparative advantage is the ultimate intellectual basis in serious economics of the claim that free trade is best. Basically what it comes down to, it's a theory that was invented by a man called David Ricardo in 1817. He was a British economist. It comes down to the idea ultimately that nations trade for the same reasons that people do. For example, you on your way to work this morning, you could stop at a Starbucks and buy a cup of coffee. Now, you could have made that coffee at home. It would take you a certain amount of time, a certain amount of effort, a certain amount of ingredients. So you don't buy things, and the analogy, of course, is for a nation. You don't import things that you could make for yourself, necessarily based on the fact that you couldn't do it for yourself. But it's a question of the relative uses of your time. So the idea of the theory of comparative advantage is if the United States imports something, that means that our time, our labor, our resources would be better used doing something else. So if we import cars from Japan, it's because not we couldn't make the cars for ourselves, but we're better off allocating our resources to, say, making airplanes instead. And the theory goes that if it's more profitable to make airplanes, then we will make airplanes. Therefore, we'll make what we're best at. The Japanese will make what they're best at. And everything is best for everyone. In a perfect world, if you leave out a lot of the complications which undo this theory, yes, it's okay as a kind of first-order construct. And I wish to emphasize at this point, I'm not against trade. I'm not in favor of autarky. But there's a whole lot more to the story, which means that you can't just take this one little theory, which you can reduce to a paragraph or two, and say, okay, that settles the question of $1.5 trillion in U.S. imports and exports a year.
Right. There is a forgotten history to free trade, and when we come back to the break, I'd like to get into that and to the consequences to America and what this trade deficit actually means in real terms. So we'll get right back to that. Still ahead in the big picture, more with our conversations with great minds. Ian Fletcher tonight after this break.
What drives the world?
The fear-mongering used by politicians.
Who makes decisions?
Considerable breakthrough has already been made.
Who can you trust?
No one who is imbued with a global missionary zeal.
Where are we heading?
State-controlled capitalism is called fascism.
When nobody dares to ask, we do. RT, question more.
Hey, Tom Hartman here, broadcasting live from Washington, D.C. Coming up today on The Big Picture.
Lindsay Lohan back in court.
Tiger has told Rachel that these women meant nothing to
People
him.
are suggesting she's a hooker.
No, she says, she's a porn star.
Come on, fire.
Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm joined by Ian Fletcher, senior economist at the Coalition for a Prosperous America and author of the book, Free Trade Doesn't Work. Ian, what is the forgotten history of trade?
Well, the forgotten history of free trade is the fact that no developed country in the entire world became a developed country by practicing it. Now, a lot of people are aware that, for example, today China is nakedly thumbing its nose at free trade in theory and practice, and they're growing like gangbusters.
I don't think most Americans know that. I think most Americans believe the story that, you know, we're free trading, they're free trading, and somehow they're winning the war because their labor's cheaper or something.
Well, the reality is the Chinese do not believe in free trade, and among themselves, they do not even claim to believe in free trade.
And it's not just the Chinese, it's the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, and the Germans, and pardon my interrupting.
No, of course, you're exactly right there. Now, the interesting part of the story is, although it's relatively well known that in East Asia and in Central Europe, countries like Germany have no use for free trade, and this goes back centuries, by the way. The intellectual roots of this are very deep, and you can trace how the Japanese learned it from the Germans and the Chinese learned it from the Japanese and so forth. What I find even more interesting is the United States itself was not a free trading country for most of its history. Even Great Britain, which is usually held up by economists as the great example of free trade, the creator of a global empire upon free trade principles, if you scratch the surface of that history even a little bit, you discover that's not so.
Well, it's Henry VII's Tudor plan that in the, well, I forget the year, what, 1540 or something like that, turned England from literally their major export was wool, and they lived in thatched mud houses with mud roads, turned them into a modern industrial economy, or at least, you know, the East India Company, 1601, Queen Elizabeth I chartered. This was all because they turned their back on free trade. I mean, wasn't Henry VII saying the same thing that Alexander Hamilton was saying, which is don't go there, don't go into free trade?
Absolutely. One of the achievements of the Renaissance, which we always hear about with respect to philosophy and art, is that they actually developed modern economics. They actually were the basis of capitalism, and two of the things they figured out, which have been airbrushed out of most economic history you hear about these days, is they figured out protectionism, and they figured out industrial policy hundreds of years ago. And you gave England as an example. You can look at the city-states of Renaissance Italy. I talk about this a bit in my book. The point is that free trade is a policy which nations tend to embrace when they're at the top of their game, and certain vested interests find it very profitable to cash in on that. It's a way of harvesting a position you've got. It's not a way of developing your country, nor, if you are already developed, is it a really good way of defending your position when other people are attacking it, which is, of course, the situation we're in today.
Yeah. Chang, the Oxford economist who wrote Kicking Away the Ladder and Bad Samaritans, the kicking away the ladder phrase came from one of those 19th century economists. I don't remember which
Friedrich
one.
List, the German economist.
That's right, you're right. And it was that you protect your economy until it's so large, and then you convince all these other countries to do free trade while you still kind of pretend to do free trade, but you don't. And that way you end up controlling the whole game. And that's what we did in this country for the first 150 years, and that's what China's doing now, right? And Japan and South Korea and Germany.
It's a very old game, and once you see through the rhetoric, it's not that hard to understand. None of this requires abstruse economics to understand what's going on. But you've got to see past the political rhetoric, and you've got to see past the ivory tower fantasy that will get spooned out to you in most economics courses. Not all, to be fair.
Yeah. So right now we have a trade deficit, what does that mean? I mean, literally, what the definition of those terms, and what does it mean in terms of its consequences?
Okay. What a trade deficit means is that the U.S. is buying more from the world than we sell back to it. Now, what that means is we're getting stuff we're not paying for by giving goods in exchange. So there's only two ways we can do that. We either have to borrow money from foreign nations to pay for it, or we can sell off existing assets that we have. And we do both. We both borrow huge amounts from abroad, both in terms of the federal government selling its treasury securities to foreign nations, and in terms of various private parties borrowing money from abroad. And we sell off assets. It can be everything from apartments in Miami to shares of IBM, what have you.
This is why one of the largest banks in America is largely owned by Saudis, that kind of thing, because we bought a lot of oil from them. They didn't buy a lot from us, so we had to give them the bank. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I mean, we had to sell it to them.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And the consequence you ask about, the first thing to understand is there's a lot of people out there who will say trade deficits don't matter. Look, the idea that trade deficits don't matter is identical with the idea this isn't real money that we're playing with. All these billions of dollars are being swapped around. This is not real money. We are, by definition, a poorer country when we have an accumulated deficit because we own less and we owe more. Okay?
A trade deficit.
Simple as that. Right.
Yeah. This is,
okay.
Now, we're not talking about the federal deficit or debt. We're talking the trade deficit. Now, and last year, how much was it, or what is it currently?
It fluctuates around the $500 billion a year mark.
And what percentage of that is just oil?
The oil trade deficit's about a quarter of our overall trade deficit. Okay,
so even if we became oil independent, we're still not making things in the United States anymore, and we're importing all this stuff. It has been argued, or I've heard it argued, that this is really a hidden tax on America, and it's also a way of essentially impoverishing America. And the people who are being impoverished first are the middle class, the former workers in the industries that were protected, and that the people who are benefiting from this are the transnational corporations and their CEOs and that bunch, and that one of the demonstrations of that is that about half of all of our international trade is not actually an American company buying from a Chinese company. It's an American company buying from an offshore division of the same American company. It's intra-company trade. Is that the case? And if so, what are the consequences of creating a trade deficit where our own companies are the biggest piece of it outside of oil?
You're absolutely right. And the big consequence here is that corporate America, its interests are no longer aligned with the interests of the United States economy as a whole. It used to be, if you turn the clock back a couple of decades, that the only way that corporations in America could make money is you take goods made by Americans, for the most part, and you sell them to Americans.
What's good for General Motors is good for America.
Well, kind of. I mean, not absolutely. But when you break that connection, you have companies which can present themselves on Capitol Hill as American companies and get what they want. But in point of fact, from an economic point of view, they're just free agents who don't really give a fig about the United States as opposed to any other place.
So if we go down in flames, in fact, I had somebody call my radio program today and say, you know, I don't get it. These politicians who are giving all these tax breaks to these corporations are moving the jobs overseas. Aren't they shooting themselves in the foot by destroying their own consumer base, by wiping out the middle class, by dropping wages and you know, my answer was, I think that they've become like a giant harvesting machine that just moves around the world, and when they're done with us, they'll go somewhere else. Is that a reasonable assessment? And how could that play out, if so?
I think you're right to a large extent. I think the big problem is that by the time the tomato hits the fan in this country, that's beyond the time horizon of corporate management. I mean, corporate management has notoriously short time horizons. They care about quarterly profits. If 10, 15 years from now, the United States has exhausted its ability to borrow more money and sell off more assets, half the CEOs will be retired by that point. They don't care.
Right. It sounds pretty damn unpatriotic. I mean, what do we do? A quick question. Permanent normal trade relations, PNTR. We have that with China right now. my understanding is when Nixon first went to China, he went there on behalf of Pepsi to try to begin the process of PNTR, which was basically, you drop your tariffs, we'll drop our tariffs, or at least with regard to these products. Do I have that right? Can you describe that? What's the history of it? When did it start?
Well, I mentioned the anti-communist aspects of the whole free trade thing earlier in the show.
Right.
When Nixon went to China on behalf of Pepsi, China was a communist country that produced almost nothing that people in the developed world wanted to buy. And the big game internationally was still supposedly stopping the USSR from taking over the world. So it was a totally different context, but we've stayed with that policy despite the fact the Cold War is over. We're in a totally different environment. The new rival for Americans is not communism, it's state capitalism, and very few people seem to understand how serious a threat that is.
State capitalism as in Chinese state capitalism, South Korean state capitalism, German state capitalism, state protected. And we used to be state-protected capitalism, and countries like Honduras, you know, literally the banana republics where we grew the bananas, were essentially the victims of America doing this.
Oh, nothing I have to say is to exonerate the United States or companies based here of any wrongdoing they may have done. But I think the reality is that the United States is relatively unique in the world in terms of practicing a fairly freewheeling form of capitalism where whoever's selling a product at the lowest price gets the business. Most of the world, they're capitalist in the sense that they're not socialists, but things are much more under government control. Corporations do what the government lets them do. And part of the quid pro quo for that is that their governments protect them, among these protections, of course, being tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And the bad news is this can be a very potent competitive system when you have big business and big government pulling in harness together, particularly
against the middle class.
Right.
Yeah, and against small business in the United States. So in the minute or two we have left here, Ian Fletcher, what do we do about this?
I said in my book the United States should go back to being a tariff-protected economy. I don't flinch at the term protectionist. It was what this country did for 150 years. I suggest in the book a flat 30% tariff on all imported goods and services. Obviously, you make the tariff flat to take
about what
political...
it historically was.
Yeah. You make it a flat tariff to take the political mischief out of the picture so you don't have companies running to Washington and lobbying to get a higher tariff from whatever it is they make. That's my down payment on a solution. Obviously, things get very complicated from there.
It's interesting because, you know, I've been saying this for a long time as the liberal on the left. Pat Buchanan has been saying this as the conservative on the right. And when Ross Perot ran for president, he got 19% of the vote, basically on that message. Do you think most Americans in their gut know this, and it's just like the politicians are so in debt to these large corporations that they have no choice but to act out this free trade dance?
Yeah, the polls seem to indicate about 60% of the public are with us on the, you and I, on the trade issue. And yet we hear just yesterday that Orrin Hatch is telling the president that not only does he want a new free trade agreement with Korea, but that has to be packaged with Colombia and Panama as well. And it's no secret who is pulling the strings there. It's multinational corporate interests behind the Republican Party, which now have leverage over President Obama. So he thinks he has to go along with that.
Yeah, they've got both parties to a large extent. Ian Fletcher, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me on your show, Tom.
Honor talking with you, and let me again recommend to all of our viewers Ian's book, Free Trade Doesn't Work. Still ahead on the big picture.
The United States was never historically a free trade country. We embraced free trade after the Second World War in order to win the Cold War. The reality was that the world was in ruins and we needed to prop up the economies of foreign nations so that they wouldn't go communist and also bind them to dependence upon ourselves. That's why we embraced free trade. There was never any point at which we discovered miraculously that the policy of protectionism that we had embraced for 150 years was wrong and that free trade was suddenly right. Okay, the reality is that For many, many years, the United States practiced something that it called free trade. In point of fact, we weren't really engaging in free trade. For example, for most of the Cold War, the whole of China was off the market. That is, out of the international market because it was a communist country. So was Russia and Eastern Europe. India was off the market because they were a socialist country. And large sections of the rest of the world, like Latin America, practiced a kind of inward-looking economics that wasn't that interested in exporting. So free trade for the longest time meant the United States, Western Europe, and developed East Asian countries like Japan. Now, of course, the whole world is in the game. One might wonder why, if the U.S. embraced free trade as a Cold War policy, why we didn't give it up when we won the Cold War. The answer is that we had created, through this policy of free trade, a vast complex of special interests which were now entrenched in power, and they were making so much money from it that they wanted it to continue whether or not it still made any geopolitical sense. America's political leaders haven't responded to these problems for two reasons. The first reason is ideology, particularly a kind of pseudo-libertarian economic philosophy that doesn't seem to notice that the laissez-faire is all on the American side. The other reason, unfortunately, is a lot of these guys have just plain been bought. Possibly the worst effect of increasingly free trade or free one-sided trade in the United States is it enables corporate America, which is, after all, in a capitalist society, the people who are not entirely but largely calling the shots, it enables them to become indifferent to the economic fate of ordinary Americans. Now, if you just think for a second, it's fairly easy to understand why this happens. If corporate America pretty much has to make a profit by selling goods made by Americans to Americans, this means that corporate America has an intrinsic interest in the productivity of Americans and in their ability to consume. Now, productivity plus consumption is prosperity. I mean, that's pretty much all it is. So if you have an economy that's set up that way, then corporate America pretty much wants what the rest of us want. And for decades in this country, from roughly about 1940 to about 1975, there was an arrangement in this country where things were set up that way. It wasn't perfect, but there was, broadly speaking, a structural alignment between what was in the interests of big corporations in this country and what was in the interest of the average American. The main way in which multinational corporations have profited from increasingly free trade in the United States in recent years, and of course, when I say free trade, I don't mean free in both directions, I mean increasingly free imports in the United States, is that it's become easier and easier for them to produce abroad, largely in countries that have lower wages, but also in countries that have aggressive industrial policies on the part of their governments to produce for export to the United States and subsidize exports to the United States. And as a result, they've made out like bandits. They've had increasing profits, remarkably enough, at a time when the rest of the economy has not been doing that well. We've been seeing record profits of Fortune 500 companies, which is a somewhat unusual result. Normally, for most of American history, corporate profits track the overall performance of the economy, but there's been an emerging disconnect there for some decades now. It's fairly obvious that the U.S. economy in recent years has suffered something of a cancerous bloat of an overgrown financial sector. Now, a lot of people have failed to notice that trade played a big role in this, or free trade, what it did is when we caused us to run a trade deficit around $500 billion a year, it fluctuates, but what you're looking at is the backwash of all our imports is that we had a flood of cheap foreign capital into the United States. This is capital that was artificially sent to the United States to buy our debt, to buy up our existing assets, because foreign nations weren't getting goods in return for their exports to us. So they have to get something. So what they get is they get claims on Americans in the form of debt, and they get claims to our existing assets, be it shares of corporate stock, real estate, or whatever. Now, as a result of this very artificial flow of capital, which was artificially pushed, make no mistake, this is not a free market outcome, artificially pushed by governments like China, Japan, and some others, you have a flood of capital in the United States which really shouldn't have been there. And when you have capital doing that, it starts looking for love in all the wrong places. So that was a major contributing cause to asset bubbles in the United States and to the general bloat of our financial sector at the expense of other sectors of our economy. Currency manipulation sounds like something technical and obscure. In point of fact, it isn't. It's very important because currency is money, so it determines what's profitable and what's not. So it determines what happens and what doesn't. Now, the deal is that when you have two countries with two currencies and they trade with each other, the relative price of those currencies, that is the number of dollars you get for one renminbi or vice versa, that's a Chinese currency, is set like any other price in a market economy. It's set by supply and demand. Now, the trick with currency manipulation is that the demand for dollars, for example, which determines the price of dollars, if there's a strong demand for dollars, the dollar will stay strong. That is, anything denominated in dollars will be expensive. Is that the demand for dollars is not only for dollars to buy American exports, the things the Chinese actually do buy from us, like the Boeing jetliners, like soybeans. There's also a demand for dollars to buy American financial instruments, which means debt and title to existing assets, which can be anything from skyscrapers in downtown Los Angeles to shares of Microsoft. As a result, if you have one country having a government that systematically forces its economy to purchase American debt and American assets rather than American goods, you can manipulate the relative price of the dollar and the renminbi, which makes American goods artificially expensive in China and makes Chinese goods artificially expensive in the US. Now, this is the reason why our trade with China doesn't automatically reach a balance. If it were not possible to buy debt and assets, then when the Chinese exported so much to us that they ran a huge trade surplus as they do, that would drive down the value of the dollar. American goods would become cheaper and cheaper over there. Their goods would become more and more expensive over here. Eventually the two cross over and we get balanced trade. That is, no trade deficit. Our exports to them equal their exports to us and vice versa. The problem is when you have the systematic currency manipulation, and there's no secret how they do it. In China, when you earn dollars by exporting to the US, you're not allowed to spend them on whatever you want. You have to take them to a government-controlled bank and swap them for Chinese currency. So you get your money and you get to be rich, but you don't get to throw them around any way you like in the international economy. And the Chinese banks, they take that money under government direction and they buy American financial instruments. A lot of it is simply T-bills. China has a voracious appetite for American T-bills, our own government securities. So as a result of this, the US dollar is artificially strong. Our trade with them stays out of balance. And we've been trying to get them to stop doing this. I believe the Congressional Research Service at one point documented, I think it was 457 different barriers to American exports worldwide. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese have since added a couple. The fact is that when you have a state capitalist economy where the government may not own everything, but it can manipulate everything from the cost of international shipping to the price of real estate, the price of electricity, the cost of capital, the cost of labor, they can indulge in an almost infinite number of tricks to subsidize their own exports and to keep out foreign imports that they don't want. The big thing to understand about state capitalism is that in the larger sweep of human history, certainly going back to the dawn of global capitalism around the time of Columbus, state capitalism is the norm, and the kind of freewheeling, free market capitalism we cherish in the United States to a significant degree is actually a relatively aberrational form of capitalism. So what the Chinese are doing is actually very normal if you look at the larger economic history of Europe, or indeed of the Far East in the 20th century. Nothing they are doing should be particularly mystifying to anybody who's paid attention to economic history. Unfortunately, nobody cares about economic history anymore, which is a tragedy, and it's one of the reasons why American economists are so blind to these issues. The way that China's lobbying in the United States and their manipulation of the American political system works is largely indirect, because the government in Beijing is well aware that a communist dictatorship is not particularly popular if it prowls the halls of Congress showing its own face. So most of their lobbying, certainly on economic issues, has been done by way of corporate America, because you have most of the Fortune 500 now making enormous profits in China. So when Beijing needs something, they talk to their American corporate buddies and they say, why don't you go send your guys up on the hill? And it's not going to look like it's us doing it, but that way we get what we want and you'll get what you want. That is a continuing flow of profits. And that's how it's done. I'm not worried about a trade war with the Chinese because, frankly, we're already in a trade war and America is losing. What I want to ask people who are afraid of a trade war is, how exactly does a country that's running a $500 billion a year trade deficit lose a trade war with the rest of the world? It's pretty much inevitable at this point that the dollar is going to slide. There's no question that the dollar is an internationally overvalued currency. Now, whether the dollar slides gradually over a number of years or whether it exhibits a sudden crash, I can't tell you. Anyone who can, they ought to come here in a private jet, because that's not $1 million question, it's $1 billion question. If you can truly answer that question, you'd be a billionaire. Now, what this means for the American people is when the dollar goes down, everything we own in dollars becomes in internationally denominated money. It becomes slightly less valuable. Now, the average American is not going to care about the fact that the internationally measured value of their house or their 401k is less than it was. But what is going to happen is it is going to create inflationary pressures in the U.S. economy when the dollar slides. And anyone who's against this, it's pretty much inevitable at this point, because the present system we have with an overvalued dollar, we get all these cheap foreign goods which make us feel richer than we are. That's coming to an end, I'm afraid. Protectionism kind of has a bad name to some extent, because it's been focused in the last couple of decades on trying to protect industries that are already dying, like the steel industry was in terrible trouble, textiles, and so forth. That is sometimes the right thing to do, but it's far more important to use protectionism as a tool to capture the industries of the future and to protect the industries of the present from falling into trouble, not simply as an ambulance to rescue industries that are already in trouble. There's a myth in this country that manufacturing is obsolescent and that we can all look forward to a bright future where we do abstract things, we provide services, and so on and so forth. The reality is that manufacturing is by no means a primitive or obsolescent sector of the economy. It's true that low-grade manufacturing of the final assembly of products where you're just sticking components together, that you can have that done by semi-illiterate labor, which is cheap labor anywhere in the world, and that is true. But if you're talking about the manufacture of sophisticated goods like computer components or jet turbine engines or even automobiles, that is simply not a fact. Why is it, I have to ask people who believe in this post-industrial mythology, that high-wage countries like Germany and Japan, which pay manufacturing wages equal to or greater than the United States, are still leading centers of car manufacturing? It's simply not true that you can't do manufacturing in developed countries. That is pure mythology. Frankly, Barack Obama's agenda on trade has been indistinguishable from that of George W. Bush. During the 2008 Democratic primaries, around the time of the Ohio and Pennsylvania primaries, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama got into a bit of a contest as to who could denounce NAFTA, and they both did at that time. Immediately after Barack Obama had the nomination sewed up, he started to backpedal on his comments, and he was actually caught sending one of his campaign advisors, Austin Goolsbee, to talk to the Canadian consulate in Chicago and tell them, well, we've been attacking NAFTA on the campaign trail, but don't worry, we don't really mean it. The present order in the United States, with the United States practicing one-sided free trade, is, I think, doomed no matter what. It's inevitably going to go away. Personally, I would have no problem with going back to the Teddy Roosevelt era of a tariff-protected economy, but there's more than one way to skin a cat here. Just as a background, because I think some of you guys might be interested, I also wrote a little booklet in company with another gentleman entitled The Conservative Case Against Free Trade. You can find that on Amazon. Now, I'm afraid there's going to be a little bit of repetition from this morning, but this is one of those controversies that really hasn't changed in 500 years, which is also something people don't realize. They think economics began in the 18th century. It goes way, way back. Now, make clear we're not here to debate trade. We're here to debate free trade, and they're just not the same thing. One is often used as an excuse for the other, just like love and free love. Yeah, I know. I couldn't resist that one. But often I debate this, and I hear people give me long lists of how wonderful trade is. They're like, your coffee in the morning, your Hyundai, your, I don't know, your Chinese food, your silk shirts or whatever. So no, I don't have a problem with trade. That's not what's under debate. The issue is whether it's going to be something that doesn't have an appropriate regulatory structure so that we don't have harm being done by it when we engage in trade. Now, some economists, and alluded to this before, some economists by their own admission don't even care about the economic interests of Americans because they believe in an ideology that says it's morally wrong to do so. Now, I know that some libertarians are going to squirm about this and they're going to say that, oh, we do care about Americans. Okay, fine. On a personal level, I congratulate them on their patriotism, and their intellectual inconsistency actually reflects well on them as human beings. The problem is that libertarianism as a set of principles does not provide any basis for preferring the interests of Americans over the interests of people anywhere else in the world. So these are probably not the sort of people we want to be taking policy advice from in a dangerous world. Now, there's a related factual premise that libertarians and other people like that have, which is that there's no interest, no difference between what's good for Americans and what's good for foreigners because they think they're wrong. that there's no such thing as international economic rivalry. But the fact is that economic rivalry is something you can see every day. It's not a giant illusion that people hallucinate and have to be somehow carefully intellectually disabused of. Now, we don't live in a zero-sum world, which is a canard that often gets thrown at you when you talk about rivalry. But we do live in a world in which sometimes what's good for you is bad for the other guy, and sometimes if you own something, they don't, and vice versa. This is true in your personal life, in your career, and it's true in international economics for similar reasons. Now, sometimes you hear political borders are economically meaningless. Professor Boudreau said that in the talk in Atlanta. Now, the reality is, you and I live in America. So, if you want to be indifferent to the economic success of the U.S., you can just go take that nice job in Singapore the next time you're unemployed. So it does make a difference where you live. It does make a difference where economic production happens. Nations have not become economically irrelevant, and they're not going to be irrelevant as long as they're relevant to the economic fates of the people who live in them. Now, that brings us to the second slide. This is the notorious trade deficit we've been bickering about all day. Now, my own experience with this is that if you understand the definitions correctly, you can think about this issue in a very fluent way and you won't be misled. If you don't get the definitions right, you won't. So, to begin, it's just the difference between our imports and our exports. So America imports roughly $500 billion a year more than it exports. That's a big sum of money. Now, it's the single biggest measure of our trade problem. It's a number comparable to federal budget deficits. It can sound technical because it is technical, but certain aspects of it are very visible. For example, when you look at poverty, you drive through rundown cities and towns in Michigan, all over the Midwest, that is connected to the trade deficit. When you look at family breakdown, that is connected to the trade deficit. So, what's wrong with the trade deficit? Well, the first thing it's doing in America right now is it destroys jobs. When goods are produced abroad and imported rather than produced here, the jobs producing them are abroad. Now, obviously, this would be okay if we were gaining other jobs just as good due to our exports. But we're not, because we're running a trade deficit, so there's an imbalance there. So, we have a net loss of jobs. And as we discussed earlier this afternoon, the unemployment rate on its own proves nothing, because all that says is somebody lost a $30 an hour job working in an automobile assembly plant and got a $6 an hour job working at Walmart. People are always going to be working somewhere. You know, there's allowance for recession and expansion, and there's going to be some unemployment. But I'll never forget reading in the National Geographic when I was a kid about how unemployment in Calcutta is really low. That's because people have jobs there doing things like taking someone their lunch for a few rupees a day or chasing birds away from someone's garden. So you have to think about quality of employment as opposed to just quantity of employment. Now, the second thing that free trade is doing to America right now is deindustrialization. It means you're not just losing jobs, you're losing entire plants and entire industries. There's a myth being promoted that we're only losing, quote, primitive industries like basic steel manufacturing, which isn't primitive, but that's a whole other story. Half the commentary on this is illiterate because people are simply not aware of what it takes to make steel these days. But Boeing is losing the manufacture of airplane wings to Mitsubishi in Japan. Does that sound primitive to you? So here's a list of industries that we have already lost. As you can see, it's not this story we were told in the early 90s of, oh, it's okay because we're only going to lose the manufacture of like sewing t-shirts and stuff, and Americans are going to do all the sophisticated stuff in the world economy because foreigners are just so dumb, they're never going to figure this out. They're never going to want the juicy bits for themselves because we're just naturally a superior nation, and that's just the order of things, and they're just dumb. No, really, that's not what's happened. These things have been taken because they're advantageous to the nations that become the host of this production and the wealth that they generate. Now, I mentioned earlier this is a big national security problem Because free trade means we have no defense against militarily important industries being stripped away from us. There's not a single plane in the Air Force that isn't dependent upon components made by likely adversaries. And because the military and the civil and military industrial bases are related, if you weaken one, you weaken the other. Now, China knows this perfectly well, and they have a strategy documented in considerable detail to use trade as a long-term weapon of military advantage against the United States. I'm not getting all conspiracy theory here. If you want to, I can't get into it in detail here, but this is properly documented stuff. That's another talk. But they are a communist dictatorship. They are not nice people. They are very disciplined about their agenda of surpassing us as a superpower. This is not a game. Now, you need to remember that when we say, quote, free trade, what we really mean is, quote unquote, free trade, because trade isn't really free. The United States has pretty much free trade. Our tariffs as a percentage of our imports are about 1% of our imports. So we're very, very close to free trade, because 1% is way less than currency fluctuations and just ordinary price changes and so forth. But it's not free in the other direction, because foreign nations manipulate their trade in a million ways. What they're doing is something called mercantilism, which you may have heard of, and it's usually discussed as this kind of dumb economic ideology from the 18th to 17th century, where kings used to be obsessed with hoarding barrels of gold in the cellar of the palace, and you're supposed to have all these dumb views of exports are good, imports are bad, or so forth. Well, no, mercantilism is a sophisticated economic strategy going back hundreds of years and practiced by our own founding fathers, still alive today, that understands that the world economy is an arena of international rivalry and that there are ways to play the game for your own advantage. Now, the nasty governments in the world, like Beijing, they do this in a very blatant, cynical, obvious way. I mean, it's just shocking, their claims that are in the press today that, oh, we really are a market economy for purposes of WTO rules, which is just giggle-inducingly ridiculous. Now, no, it's absurd. It's a state capitalist country. Other big economies like Japan, like the European Union, they manipulate things in a much more subtle, polite, politically correct way. But they still do it. So the only way to have free trade for real would be to have world government, and I don't think that's especially going to be popular here. Frankly, it's not something I support. So how do they manipulate trade? Well, for a start, they engage in currency manipulation, because if you make a nation's currency artificially cheap, you could increase that nation's exports and reduce its imports. China did this for years and years. Japan is still doing it. The entire euro currency is looked at one way, a giant currency manipulation scheme for Germany, because by averaging out the currency for strong economies like Germany with weaker economies like Italy and Spain, Germany gets a currency that's way too cheap, those other countries get a currency that's way too expensive, and you get exactly what we've been seeing, where Germany is the only large solvent state in Europe. So, in Korea, I've learned, if you buy a foreign car, it's well known this tends to trigger a tax audit by the Korean equivalent of the IRS. So people get the message and they don't buy foreign cars. In Germany, the major banks tend to hold the shares of both corporations and their suppliers. So if, for example, BMW tried to buy tires from an American company rather than a German one, the bank would say, and I'm not going to imitate a German accent because the last time I did that someone accused me of something, "You idiot, this company, wie pardon," no kidding, will go bankrupt, knock it off. So people get the message. There are a lot of understandings, gentlemen's agreement. There's kind of cronyism. A lot of foreign countries, you call it crony capitalism. It works very well in the more sophisticated countries. You have arrangements between labor and between government and between capital, what people do and do not do, and making sure that Deutschland Aktiengesellschaft is successful at the expense of, the United States. So these countries are doing very well. They're the ones who are currently lending money to us, not the other way around. They're not going to take our advice and give up their arrangements, their manipulation of trade, just because we think, who are in a state of crisis, that our way of doing things is better. Now, the reality is that the U.S. right now is being forced to compete with foreign state capitalism. People use the term capitalism in a very clumsy way because we all grew up during the Cold War where there was communism, there was capitalism, and that seemed clear. Well, now we have something a little more subtle and much worse, which is we have a rivalry between more or less free market capitalism. The U.S. is not a complete free market, but as things go, it's not unreasonable to use the term. And then you have state capitalism, where you basically have massive government ownership and control of the corporate sector. Now, any number of people will tell you this cannot work, and you can write beautiful, ideologically impressive essays explaining why it will never work. I'm sorry, it does work. I wish it didn't, because then we wouldn't have the problems we have. But the fact is that countries that practice this are getting very rich. Now, the pictures up behind me are, we have our stock exchange, which is where capital, among other things, among other places, is allocated in this country. China has a Ministry of Commerce. Japan has a Ministry of Finance. That's how things work. I'm sorry. So, logical question is why the U.S. doesn't do something about its trade problem. In large part, this is because American multinational corporations simply aren't American companies anymore. They get given a kind of pass because they're headquartered here, but frankly, this is frequently just the location of the CEO's office. They like the situation just fine. The Chinese like it just fine. They don't send their own lobbyists to walk the halls of Congress. They send lobbyists hired by American multinational corporations who do what they want. It works perfectly well for them. Now, we talked about the trade deficit before. Why it doesn't matter, supposedly. No, it does matter. Everybody likes the story it doesn't matter because everyone likes a free lunch. The idea you can get stuff for free. Now, this is going to be repetitive, but I'm going to repeat it because it's so important. The key to understanding the trade deficit is that when we get goods from abroad, goods means goods or services, when we get stuff from abroad, there's only three ways we can get it. We have to give something back unless we're trading with Santa. It's either goods we produce today, goods we produced yesterday, or goods we promise to produce in the future. That is it. Anything that looks like a fourth alternative is really just some repackaging of those three. Goods we produce today, that means we get Toyota cars from Japan and we sell a Japanese Boeing aircraft. Goods we produced yesterday means we're selling off existing wealth, like shares of IBM or a house in San Diego or something, anything of value that you can sell. And goods we promise to produce in the future means we go into debt. That is, you give me the money now and I'll give you money in the future. This is exhaustive. Now, what this means is that when we run a trade deficit, that is to say, when we do not requite our imports with exports of equal value, we must be doing those two things, either goods we produced yesterday or goods we promised to produce tomorrow. So either we're selling off assets or going into debt. Now, why is this a bad thing? It's very simple. It's not even economics. It's just accounting. When you have fewer assets and more debt, you own less and you owe more. Your wealth is less. That's really it. Now, we talked before about deindustrialization and job loss. That's the other effect. But just to get clear on the trade deficit, no matter what else happens, we owe more and we owe less. Now, one thing you'll get thrown at you is free trade is the American way, sweet land of liberty, et cetera, et cetera. And it's tempting to believe this. It's an easy issue to wrap the flag in. But the problem is, every one of the presidents on American money was a protectionist. The founding fathers were protectionists. Lincoln was a protectionist. Teddy Roosevelt was a protectionist. The U.S. was a tariff-protected economy, openly and explicitly from its founding until after World War II. Alexander Hamilton, the guy on the $10 bill, the only guy who wasn't a president who's on money, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, the one economist among the founding fathers, he understood that if the U.S. had had free trade, it would simply end up as an agricultural appendage of Europe, which was the economically advanced portion of the world at the time. So we embraced protectionism in order to become an industrial power in our own right. The logic of this is the same logic, by the way, that England itself used when it was a backwater to become a serious economic power starting under King Henry VII. It's the same logic South Korea used after the Korean War to rebuild its own economy and become almost a developed nation as it is today. The principles, if you look at economic history, they don't change. The pattern is very consistent. And yet, the scary part of the pattern is that nations at the top of their game, like Britain in the 19th century, can acquire the illusion that free trade is a good idea. And the Brits embraced free trade in the 19th century, and they went into decline relative to the United States and Germany, which were still protectionist. And now the United States has embraced free trade at the moment that we were at the top of our game. By the way, that's very important. You see, when I sat down nearly 10 years ago now to write my book, I knew that America's history had started out protectionist. So I was very curious. One of the questions I wanted to research was, where's the inflection point? Where did America change its mind, and why? What discovery by what economist at what university suddenly revealed this policy had been a mistake and we all have to be free traders now? I discovered it never happened. What happened was, after World War II, when we had to prop up and rebuild Europe and the countries in East Asia against the communist threat, we threw our markets open to the rest of the world for political reasons, not because we'd suddenly had a change of heart on the economics. And at the time, we were so invincibly economically strong. I mean, remember, the U.S. is half the world economy in 1945. And if you leave out the communist part of the world economy, in 1945, the U.S. economy is larger than the entire rest of the world economy put together. So we thought we could do anything, and for a few years we probably could. But it was a political decision. There was no economic discovery we ever made that free trade was better than protectionism. It was purely politics. Now, just want to make clear, I'm the last guy on earth who's in favor of stupid forms of protectionism, and I'm well aware of the fact that they exist. I was chatting to some people at the reception about U.S. sugar policy, because the U.S., the one thing that the U.S. has a really protectionist policy on is sugar, and the interesting thing is that the U.S. had a protectionist policy in sugar, you know, going back more than 100 years. I don't really know why. I do know it didn't make sense when McKinley was president, and it doesn't make sense today. So I'm not in favor of any of that. In my book, I said what you want to rebalance our trade, so you get rid of the trade deficit, so you have imports and exports are equal. And probably the best way to do that is with a flat tariff. If you had a flat tariff of, say, 20% on all imports, you would relocate the production of sophisticated goods like LCD flat panel displays from South Korea and Japan back to California. You would not relocate the production of T-shirts from Guatemala and the Philippines back to New York because the difference in wages is too great. What that tells you is a flat tariff would have approximately the effect that you want to have. You don't need to have a lot of subtlety and finesse and possible political corruption in what you do in order to get the policy that you want. And so there is the possibility of straightening out this mess without blundering into an economy that's just hopelessly meddled with by government setting tariff rates, which I'm well aware is a possibility, but we don't have to go in that direction. By the way, if you want to talk about political mischief, trade agreements like NAFTA are even worse than free trade itself. Now, they're not really free trade agreements anyway, given that America had basically already opened its markets and foreign nations have no intention of doing so. These treaties are mainly about protecting property rights, foreign investors, patents, copyrights, and so forth. But the WTO has a totally failed track record at enforcing free trade on nations that don't want to practice it. It has an effect on countries like the United States that have serious legal systems and the rule of law. It has basically no effect at all on countries like China. However, these free trade agreements do enable unelected foreign judges to interfere with the right of Americans to make our own laws. Our agreements under investor-state dispute settlement with NAFTA, or under the WTO, enable these panels of experts to decide whether certain American policies are legitimate or not. I personally view that as outright unconstitutional. At the very least, it's undemocratic and I think un-American. So it's a threat to our sovereignty. It's a threat to American democracy. It's a threat to things like our environmental laws and our laws designed to protect us against another financial crisis. So even if you're in favor of free trade itself, you should still oppose trade agreements like NAFTA. Now, I want to finish by talking about something which I left to the end because I didn't know how much time there was going to be. And this is a little bit technical. But I did want to tell you, for those of you who are studying economics in school, or those of you who may be intimidated by the appearance that there is solid technical economics on the side of free trade. The key theory we're talking about here is the so-called theory of comparative advantage, which is basically a mathematical distillation of all these things that Professor Boudreau was telling you about, potatoes and tomatoes and swapping this and your neighbors and people in Mexico, whatever. If you mathematize that and then claim it's a good thing, you get theory of comparative advantage, which goes back to the 19th century British economist called David Ricardo. Now, the theory in and of itself is fine. The problem is it rests on hidden assumptions. And I identified 8 in my book, Free Trade Doesn't Work, that it has. It makes assumptions like trade is broadly balanced over time. But it's not. The U.S. has had a chronic trade deficit for decades now. So either the theory is wrong, because that's what the theory says should happen, or if it's treated as an assumption, if the assumption is wrong, then the theory doesn't hold. So it falls apart if you look at it in detail. It also assumes that capital isn't mobile between nations, which it is. Interestingly, David Ricardo, who invented this theory in 1817, admitted that if capital is mobile between nations, then the theory doesn't hold. So, as I said, if you scrutinize the sophisticated theories underlying all this, they do fall apart. These economists don't want to talk about that. They usually kind of snow you with overly technical mumbo-jumbo, and unless you know exactly how to call them on it, and they get nasty. Some of them are honest and they say, okay, I believe in free trade, but yes, there do exist conditions under which it doesn't work. And say, okay, well, are we in those conditions now? Well, I don't know. Well, we have a $400 billion a year trade deficit. So another assumption is that it doesn't matter what industries you have. All industries are equal value. So if imports in one industry kill off a bunch of workers, a bunch of factories, well, they're just going to go do something else. Those workers will go produce something else. Well, the reality is maybe they will and maybe they won't. It's not a guaranteed thing. It's especially not guaranteed when you combine free trade with pseudo-free trade, which is free on one side, not on the other, and a deliberate domestic strategy of foreign governments to do things like steal American intellectual property. How many of you remember Nortel? It used to be a big manufacturer of computer equipment, routers, switches and stuff. They were basically wiped out by Chinese theft of their intellectual property. That's basically what happened. They're Canadian, so they don't have, quite the muscle on their side that American companies do, but that's a cautionary tale. And the other side is very disciplined about acquiring industries. All this is gigantic flies in the ointment of free trade. The theory doesn't work if you have a thumb on the scale at all these points. One final thing I'll leave you with. The assumption is made that trade has no effect on income inequality. Now, I am not particularly a partisan guy, left or right, so I'm not going to do a hard position on income inequality is good, bad, or whatever. But I can tell you that trade has huge effects, distributional effects, on income. So if you think that it's just okay to have free trade because it's not going to affect your workers as opposed to the high-income population, it's not going to affect labor as opposed to capital, it has huge effects. And the really interesting thing is the possibility that free trade can make most people worse off by affecting income equality. That can be true, even if all the other good things they say about free trade are right. And then if they're not, it's even worse. So, I think that's the end of my talk, and it's your turn, Ron.
Thank you.
Give Mr. Fletcher 2 minutes if he'd like to, and then questions.
When you talk about good news, you talk about how great things really are. Look, the U.S. is still a first world country. But as I said in our afternoon session, it's all a question of baselines. If you want to talk about people who are living on, the average income that people have, if you actually look up what U.S. average income is, I don't think you could live on that. You forget that we're all yuppies here. The idea that there are not huge sections of this country that are in serious economic plight, I'm sorry, that is not borne out by simply looking at aggregate figures that prove basically that the U.S. is a first world country, which it is. Other things. You mentioned the astonishing news that government officials or bureaucrats can successfully run countries. I realize that rhetoric is very tempting, and I have no sympathy for meddling bureaucrats in this country or whatever, but you're putting your head in the sand if you think that China's system isn't working for them. It's a grossly unethical government and hostile to us, but yes, it is working, and it is a threat. I would also point out that I said that I support a flat tariff, so I'm well aware of the dangers of government manipulation. So, as I put in my book, which has been printed any number of times, it's a formal commitment I can't wriggle out of. I said the solution's probably a flat tariff. Now, in terms of the assumptions of the theory of comparative advantage, yes, you can relax some of those assumptions and still have the theory of comparative advantage, but what you lose is the automatic proof that everything is necessarily going to be good for you. As for the professor's point that, well, we have free trade between Ohio and Indiana, so therefore we should have it between the U.S. and China, all you've really pointed out there is the place where you draw a national economic border is something that has to be properly considered, and the policy you have for a nation, depending on what your size is going to be different. I advocate a flat tariff for the United States. If I were an Irishman talking about Ireland's economy, obviously it's too small a country for that to be appropriate there. But that's just saying that the policy is going to vary according to the size of your economy.
I'm Peter Merritt. I talked a little bit earlier this afternoon about Anderson, Indiana. I will use a personal experience and then ask a question. I was an IT executive with DuPont. The division was sold to Carlyle Group out of Washington, D.C. I had a team of 6 American people working for me, and the decision was made that all of it was going to go to India. These were all 70 and plus jobs by Americans, all lost to foreign classification. I don't understand morally how you can do that as an executive. I've stayed in touch with all of my people. I've made sure that they've all got new jobs inside this country, doing well and surviving. But this is not easy. I'm sorry, it ended up being more of a personal statement than anything else. But to me, this is where the rubber meets the road between what you do as an executive and what is happening in the American economy. I'll let you answer accordingly.
No one has ever claimed that economic change does not cause some dislocation. But 2 points. The economic dislocation occurs whether that change crosses political borders or whether it occurs by changes in consumer spending patterns within the domestic economy. When the computer revolution occurred, starting mostly in Silicon Valley, that put a lot of Americans in secretarial pools and typewriter factories out of jobs. There is no difference. I understand that it's hard to lose a job, but here's a statistic. The number of jobs that China is accused of taking from America since China entered the WTO in 2001, the maximum estimated number of jobs that China is estimated to have destroyed is 4 million. That's a top estimate. Do you know the number of jobs destroyed in America? I'm talking the number of layoffs and displaced workers, not quits. the average number of jobs destroyed in America every month because of that, excuse me, just because of any economic change, 1.7 million a month. Now, there are also jobs created every month, and so it generally, when the economy is doing well, the net number of jobs rises. But it takes only 2 months for ordinary economic change in America to destroy the number of jobs that China is accused of destroying over the last 16 years.
I'm not talking about that.
Wait for the mic. We'll talk after. Let's let it know.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Fletcher. So you talked about how if you look at the average income in America, it's fairly hard to live on. I think it's fairly common knowledge that people in the lower income classes spend the vast majority of their income and they have very few savings. And I'd like to hear your response as to what a 20% tariff that I think you would admit would raise a lot of prices, what the effect of that kind of tariff would have on people in the lower income classes, their ability to live well. And I would also be interested in your response to the fact that I'm interested in your perspective on China, because I looked at an article recently that said their debt is over 300% of GDP, which I don't think anyone would agree is sustainable. So I'd be interested to see how you work that into your statement that what they're doing, subsidizing all of their industries, is working.
Okay, let me answer your first question. Your perfectly reasonable question. What you're basically asking about is the inflationary effects of a tariff. Now, as I said in my book, if you want to have a 20 or 30% tariff, you need to bring it in gradually. And if you phase it in over, say, 10 years, particularly in a highly deflationary environment that we have, and if you take into account the fact that it's not necessarily as inflationary as you think, because you're raising the price on foreign goods, but as you relocate production to the US, they're not necessarily going to have the same cost structure. So, yes, there is a cost, but the countervailing benefit is that you are going to be creating jobs for these people. And the other thing I would point out is that the cheapness of imports with an inflated dollar and a trade deficit, that's an unsustainable and artificial thing, which is going to come to a nasty end at some point. Anyway, if you gradually phase in a tariff, what you're basically doing is you're phasing out the cost of getting rid of that delusory free lunch, and you're phasing it out in a way that benefits us and that is under our control. Now, with respect to your issue with China and the huge debt levels in China, we've been hearing for years and years and years that China was headed for a crash. There was a book by Gordon Chang in 2005, The Coming Collapse of China. I don't see that seems to have happened. You have to understand that particularly when you're looking at the financial system of the East Asian states, particularly countries that have very peculiar financial systems like China and Japan, debt doesn't have the same meaning there as it does here, because for a start, a lot of that debt is intergovernmental debt, so it's just basically an accounting convention between government and entities. They also have a very tightly regulated financial system that's not susceptible to the kind of volatility that ours has. So obviously they, like anybody else, are capable of having an excessive level of debt. Whether 300% of GDP is that for them, just because it would be an absurd number for us, does not hold.
First off, can you hear me okay? Okay, first off, thanks for both of you coming to Hillsdale. I've been to about 35 countries in my life. Everywhere I've ever gone, the old Yankee dollar was always welcome, at least until the last 20 years in Europe. But Professor Boudreau, my question specifically to you, but I'd like both of you to address it. When I as an American spend my Yankee dollars overseas on anything, I'm kind of depleting the accumulated capital of America. That money leaves, and in your example of Mexican tomatoes, It seems to me there's a large kind of a shadow economy of Yankee dollars out there in the world where Professor Boudreau, that money doesn't necessarily get repatriated to America and come back to us ever. Does a lot of those Yankee dollars go overseas and stay overseas? Oil's priced in dollars, drugs are priced in dollars. There's a lot of other economies that are priced in dollars. Does a lot of that accumulated capital of America leave America to never come back, to float around the world in Yankee dollars for the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Most of it does come back. Most of it does come back. But I'll repeat again, that which doesn't come back, that's a boon to us. You know, Frederick Bastiat, another hero of Hillsdale, I'll point out. Frederick Bastiat wrote a famous essay in 1848, I believe it was, or 1846, entitled The Petition of the Candlemakers. And he pointed out that the sun keeps sending light and heat to the world, to France, in his case, every day. And the sun charges nothing for it. And it gives all these wonderful benefits to the people of the earth, and it asks nothing in return. If foreigners insist on giving us steel and automobiles and consumer electronics and textiles and fuels for just pieces of paper that cost us virtually nothing to produce, I say let them do it. They impoverish themselves when they do it. They make us richer when they do it. It is not the case that, contrary to what Mr. Fletcher says, it is not the case that a trade deficit means that we are going further and further into debt. Again, I point out, because it must be pointed out again and again, that the amount of capital in the world, the amount of productive capital, capital that produces things for people to consume, the amount of capital is not fixed. And the only way you can get, or a necessary condition for an outflow of funds from the United States not coming back to the U.S. to the extent that they don't come back, to somehow impoverish the United States, a necessary condition for that to hurt us would be for the amount of capital in the world to be fixed. And it's just not fixed. We see it around us daily. Oh, no, not daily. We see it around us yearly. The amount of capital keeps rising in the third world even today, certainly in America, certainly in Europe, in China too. I don't worry about foreigners giving us stuff in exchange for pieces of paper with pictures of our dead statesmen. Let them do it.
I stopped believing in Santa when I was 6.
It's not a Santa. There's no Santa here. There's no. The people who believe in Santa are the people who believe that foreigners are sending us something and want nothing in return. It's you who believe in Santa.
Wait a minute. You were just telling us a minute ago that if foreigners want to give us something and get nothing back, that's great. Now,
yes, but I don't think they do it.
Okay, well, it follows from that we have to be giving them something of value in return. Now, if we're giving them things we make, that's great, because then we have an industry, we produce a thing, we create employment, we create profits. If we don't give them goods we produce today, we either have to give them goods we produced yesterday, which means selling off existing assets, or goods we promise to produce tomorrow, which means going into debt and servicing
that is
debt
simply
later.
Untrue. That is simply
untrue. Okay, so what's
untrue.
the fourth way?
The fourth way is, this is the point about capital not being fixed. When they invest here, the capital stock grows. More output from that capital grows, and that's what they get repaid with. The capital stock is not fixed. America's been running a consistent current account trade deficit since 1977. We've gotten richer since then. If this story is correct, we should be in poverty by now. We're not. We're getting richer.
Okay, there are a couple of things that I can explain to
deconstruct
a
baseline.
that. Okay, first there's the baseline. There's how rich we are versus how rich we would be. Second, with respect to your idea that there's a, quote, fourth way, when you describe basically foreign direct investment in the United States, you're talking about two separate things. You're talking about the creation of an asset in the United States, and then you're talking about the existence of the asset, the location of the asset, like a car plant that's located in the United States, and then you're talking about the ownership of the asset, whether it's owned by foreigners or owned by Americans. Now, it's true that we're better off when BMW builds a factory in the United States. That's true. But we would be even better off if Americans rather than Germans owned it, because then Americans rather than Germans would own the wealth and receive the profits.
But in a lot of cases, it wouldn't be built at all. It's built by the creativity and risk-taking and enterprise of those people. We don't have a monopoly on that. And their enterprise, their risk-taking, they don't stop us from being enterprising and risk-taking. These things add together. One doesn't offset the other.
That's a piece of rhetoric so beautiful I could cry, but it doesn't actually
I could cry
turn on the
too, but
accounting at all.
it's not rhetoric. Tell me, what is the logical problem with it?
The logical problem is that we're talking about two separate things. We're talking about the location of assets and the ownership of assets. And the fact is that foreign direct investment is great if you bring these things into existence in the United States, and they produce wealth, they produce profits, they produce jobs. But we would still be better off if we owned it as opposed to somebody else owning it.
I'm sorry, but again, that's like me saying Microsoft is great, but it would be better off if I owned it rather than Bill Gates owning it.
But that's actually true.
Well, yes, but what's not true is that Microsoft would not be built if it depended upon me. It required Bill Gates.
What you're talking about there is you're talking about the separation of ownership and control, which is a hallmark of modern capitalism. It's entirely possible. In fact, it already happens every day that decisions about what gets built and what gets produced are separate from decisions of who owns the assets. Most Americans are completely unaware of the fact that when you drive down the street and you drive by Walmart, Walmart is partially owned by all these different investors and all these different places and these pension funds and these hedge funds and so on and so forth. These underlying financial flows are what determine our wealth, and that's the place where you have to draw the baseline and say there's what we own, what somebody else owns, and how well off we would be if we hadn't gradually been liquidating our financial position to pay for imports. It's hard to see, because you can't see it just by looking at a car factory, but there is this subterranean fact of financial claims on assets, which are ownership, which are ultimately our wealth. That's what I'm talking about.
May I ask you this? The data show that the financial wealth of households and nonprofits in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has consistently risen since the end of World War II and continues to consistently rise, and it shows no dip when the trade deficit rises. How do you explain that?
Well, the data also show that the standard of living of the average Soviet citizen consistently rose from 1945 to 1989. Yeah, sure, but compared to where it should have been if it had not been a communist country, it's just a baseline problem again.
But wouldn't you see a change in the trend line? How could you not see a change in the trend line?
No, not necessarily. If we're talking about the wealth we have as opposed to the wealth we should have had if we hadn't made the economic policy mistakes that we did make, it's perfectly possible to say, oh, I have a 401k. It has $250,000 in it. That's great. Well, what if it should have had $300,000 in it if you hadn't invested in pets.com?
So in other words, you can see that the data support my point. Oh, excuse me, you can see that the data as recorded support my point, but if the data truly reflected what you believe, they would say something different. So the data doesn't show that I'm wrong, the data shows that you're wrong, but if the data were correct, they would show that you're right.
Another beautiful piece of rhetoric, and if I were sitting in the audience, I probably wouldn't believe myself, but you've missed the point, which is that your data, all they show is how well off we are. They show that we have $250,000 in our 401k. That is not false. It just doesn't say anything about whether we could have had $300,000 in our 401k if we hadn't made the mistake of buying pets.com.
In other words, yes.
Let's take another question.
All right. Thank you both so much for coming out. It's been very informative and entertaining. My question was for Mr. Fletcher. So how, under the tariff that you're proposing, would American products and exports be able to stay competitive in the world market, especially considering the high taxes, regulations, labor laws that we have here? Also, how would they compete with the quality of other markets, considering that a lot of these markets that we've lost, we no longer have the specialization in labor or manufacturing to make them happen?
Well, the point that you've made there when you talk about the excess costs posed on American industry by overregulation, that actually tends to support my way of thinking because, for example, if you have steel business and then you impose pollution controls that add $10 a ton, well, if you don't have controls on imports, you're just going to end up shifting production to China where they have no pollution controls at all, and you're going to make the pollution problem even worse. So that's actually an argument for protectionism, what you just gave us.
So one problem with that is, so I agree that these, as I think Ian does as well, that these regulations are often a problem. But then when you use a tariff to protect the industries that are so regulated, you mask the problem. You hide from the economy. You hide from the voting populace the fact that these policies are doing damage. And I would prefer a policy that reveals the damage. My colleague Walter Williams drove this point home to me, that tariffs mask the ill effects of bad regulatory and tax policies here at home. And if we didn't have the tariffs, if we didn't have the tariffs, if we had more open global competition, the harmfulness of those bad regulatory and tax policies would be more evident, and we would perhaps have fewer of those bad policies.
We have time for one more question. Thank you very much for coming, both of you. My question is for Professor Fletcher. So we talk a bit about creative destruction as economists, and Dr. Boudreau alluded to this. He mentioned this in his speech about how, if we've had these industries such as, the polio vaccine that was created and came along, and it wiped out entire industries, the nurses that were there to take care of them, and, all of these industries, but we had this vaccine that, obviously saved millions, if not billions of lives. So how is it that we cannot equate the creative destruction story to the trade story? Because you get the same thing with trade when you get improved technologies from overseas. That you showed that list in your speech that showed all of these destroyed industries, but I think what's missing is that there's improved technologies that came to replace those industries. So how do you, I guess, combat the creative destruction in your line of argumentation?
Okay, that's a legitimate point, but I can answer it. The first thing is, I never said I was against trade. I'm against free trade. More specifically, I'm against, quote, free, unquote, trade. So I'm not in favor of a world where we don't have access to innovative technologies from foreign countries. Second thing is, you talk about creative destruction, which comes from Joseph Schumpeter. There's a danger in economics, when you're studying economics, of falling so in love with certain concepts. I mean, creative destruction is a really exciting concept. It enables you to beat up a lot of deadwood liberals, et cetera, that you forget it's not the only logic that applies to the situation. And the other logic that I described, for example, with the trade deficit, with the issues of deindustrialization and so forth, that is also a part of the picture.
Or closing. Each person can have a minute closing. Is that okay?
Well, sure.
If you'd like it.
Well, I'll just say one thing. I just brought this book with me. It's called For Free Trade. It's a series of essays on free trade, very vigorous defenses of free trade. Authored, it was speeches delivered by one of history's great advocates of free trade. He's a man named, let me see here, Winston Churchill. For free trade, just FYI.
Fletcher?
I don't know if you guys realize this, but if you know your British history, you know that Mike Catt knows more economics than Winston Churchill did. He was probably the worst chancellor of the exchequer of the 20th century. Number one thing I would ask you to remember is first, there is no free lunch. The trade deficit is real money. And the number two thing I'd like to ask you to remember is America's heritage, the founding fathers, the entire history of this country, going from a third world backwater to the greatest industrial power in the world, was protectionist.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you both very much. Our hospitality will begin upstairs, and we can keep debating over drinks. Thanks.
That I will do.
Pleasure. Winston Churchill? That I've never seen.
Classic.
Yeah. So I have 2 minutes for response. Very quickly, with respect, I do not understand that whatever definition of libertarian Mr. Fletcher is working with. It does not mean that libertarians don't care about Americans. The case I made for trade was all about how it helped Americans, and I believe it does. I believe it also helps foreigners. I see nothing wrong with helping foreigners, but the chief case for trade that I made here is of its benefit to Americans. Secondly, there's a fourth option that Mr. Fletcher overlooks about the trade deficit. When foreigners invest here, they often get repaid with goods that they produce here. The BMW factory in Greer, South Carolina, not only creates jobs for Americans and produces automobiles that Americans can purchase and Americans can export, it produces the payments, the profits, out of which the German investors get repaid. It is simply not the case, because the capital stock in the world is not fixed. When our trade deficit rises, that does not mean that we necessarily are made poorer. It can be that, but in fact, it's not. I have a question just to ask you. You can probably, it'll be a rhetorical question, but if I ask you, at what period in history was America's manufacturing output at its peak, its inflation-adjusted manufacturing output at its peak? What would you say? Today. Yeah, so, and I have some graphs up there that I can show you if time allows later. The size of the capital stock, the monetary value of the capital stock in the United States today is at an all-time high. It's not the case that we have been basically throwing the dining room furniture into the fireplace in order to heat our homes. The capital stock has been growing, and it's been growing in part not only because of Americans' savings and the attractiveness of the American economy, but also because of the investments that foreigners make here.
Do I get a response?
Sure. Well, we're going to the question. Let's go with questions, and then you can respond as part of your answer. And we got a whole nother hour of this, so load up. Please raise your hand, and the mic will be brought to you. Questions, please, not life stories. That would be great.
Okay, I have a question. So you gave the example of the tomatoes, and the Mexican farmer bought something over here. Supposing the Mexican farmer bought some Mexican bananas or some Chinese sneakers, to broaden that idea, the whole argument assumes that people are going to want stuff from us. And projecting into the future, is that a guarantee that they're going to want stuff from us?
Yes, it is a guarantee that if they want our dollars, that means they want something from us. The particular person who sells tomatoes to Americans, he might not want something from us, but how can he spend dollars in Mexico? He has to transform those dollars into Mexican pesos. Why would any Mexican bank give that person valuable Mexican pesos in exchange for pictures of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington if someone in Mexico did not want to spend those dollars or invest those dollars in the United States? And as I said, so it has to be the case that the American dollars come back here.
So that they're trapped if they buy...
Say again?
Are they trapped? If they take American dollars, can't they spend them in China?
Yes, but then why would the Chinese accept the dollars? The Chinese...
I don't know. I'm just saying.
I'll tell you, they accept the dollars because the Chinese want to spend the dollars here. In fact, that's how world trade works.
Let's go one step further and say they don't want our dollars, period.
Well, that would be the best of all worlds for Americans. Then we get free stuff. We would get tomatoes and cars and steel in exchange for pieces of paper. That would be the best of all worlds. I wish that would happen. And unfortunately, it's not what happens. The Chinese accept dollars from the Mexicans only because, for the same reason you accept dollars. Would you accept monopoly money for something valuable? No. The reason is because you know you can't spend it. You accept dollars for something valuable only because you know you can spend it. And the Chinese are no different than you, sir.
Mr. Fletcher, sure. Is this thing on? There we go. Yeah. I think we've slipped once or twice already into a couple of conceptual tangles that unfortunately I can't make go away because I've been doing this for years. The one thing I can tell you is the easiest mistake to make when thinking these issues through, like when Professor Boudreau just said there's a fourth option, it's all a baseline trick. You've got to be very careful considering what baseline you are comparing with the outcome that you got. Because the question is not, are you better off or worse off? The question is, are you better off or worse off than you would have been if the other policy under debate were being discussed? Were being adopted. Now, for example, when Professor said, okay, you have Germans own a factory in the United States, they make BMWs, some of which are exported, so that pays for the money that they spent building the factory. The question is not whether that's true. The question is, would Americans be richer if Americans rather than Germans owned the factory? And the answer is yes, because then Americans rather than Germans would be receiving the profits. That's the question you have to ask about foreign investment. It's not, are we better off having foreign investment or not having foreign investment? The question is, are you better off, given any factory, office building, whatever productive asset, are you better off with us owning it or with foreigners owning it? And the answer is, we're better off with us owning it, because then its value is part of our wealth and its profits are part of our income.
Hello. Thank you both for coming to Hillsdale and us speaking today and later on today. Professor Brudeau, your argument seems to be predicated upon free trade as a universal, mutually beneficial act for the U.S. and any foreign entities that we happen to engage in. But my question for you, and I apologize, it's a slight bit meandering, but it seems that you're phrasing it as solely an economic issue independent of any potential social or cultural effects. And so when you talk about the benefit to the U.S. and different things like that, I'm wondering how much of a benefit is it when you have to, it seems that by necessity, you have to factor in the cultural and social effects that happen with these foreign entities, because we're not just acting in isolation. It can't just be an economic issue, because it's not just dollars, it's also people. So could you speak on that, please?
Yes. So first of all, I have two responses very quickly. The main arguments against free trade are almost always posed in economic terms. It's as Ian does. The argument is that it reduces Americans' jobs, it reduces Americans' wealth. I'm happy to go along with those arguments. But I agree with you that the fuller context in which free trade should be discussed is larger. It's not just economic. And here's one of the non-economic effects of free trade that I like very much. It is consistent with freedom. It's consistent with liberty. It is not a system in which government bureaucrats get to superintend your spending decisions or your investment decisions. Any system of protection is a system where you have government bureaucrats in the capital penalizing you when you spend your money in ways that they don't like. I find that to be culturally offensive.
I think the answer to that, it's real easy to wave the flag and talk about liberty equals free trade. It's a lot harder to explain why all the founding fathers were protectionists, all the presidents up until 1950s. It's very strange. George Washington, protectionist. Lincoln, protectionist. Did they know something about liberty? I'm not sure. Other point I would make is free trade is quote-unquote free trade because in the world, in reality, free trade means the U.S. and a few other countries like the U.K. adopt free trade for real. Other major players do not. So in reality, what free trade means is you adopt this policy, you're building up a nuclear-armed dictatorship that despises the United States and is on the verge of edging us aside as a superpower. And if you think that arming Beijing is a victory for liberty in this world, I don't know what to say.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I guess mine's going to be more observational, which will lead to a question. I have worked for two major U.S. corporations, both of which I've watched spend themselves into a demise, one being DuPont, the other being General Motors. And if you look at flyover country, this place is full of empty factories, which I don't understand. And that's as things have moved overseas and what we call free trade. Japan comes here to trade with us. Try to find an American car in Japan, you'll have a hard time. And so based on at least the reality of partly of what I'm seeing, I'm asking an open question of how do you protect American investment and American value with the trade proposition?
The fact is, Americans are wealthier today than we have been at any time. The American capital stock is higher. It's simply a myth to think that there are all these closed down factories. You can find some, of course, and some locales are doing worse than others, but some locales are doing better than others. You can't just look at one individual town, one individual place, or one individual company. It's not the case that America is in industrial decline. It's said all the time, but repeating a falsehood does not make that falsehood true.
I'm afraid that's an example of exactly what I was warning you against a few minutes ago, namely the baseline trick. Yes, it's true that the United States is wealthier than it's been at any point in its history. That's not what's relevant. May I finish? No, I didn't even say what's relevant. What's relevant is not where Americans are, level of wealth X, greater than level of wealth Y in the past, but where we are relative to where we should be. We should be a much richer country, as we would be if we had not deindustrialized vast sections of this country. And if you think that deindustrialization is a myth, can you explain to me why the United States Air Force cannot put a single plane into the sky that does not contain components made by likely adversaries?
One of the great benefits of free trade is that the global supply chain now is truly global. Yes, of course, Americans are able to put more and better planes in the sky precisely because we get creativity from all around the world. We get the cheapest imports from all around the world. We could, if we relied only upon things literally that were extracted from the United States, our fighting power would be less, not greater. I agree with you that the baseline is an important issue.
My question is for Mr. Boudreau, for Mr. Fletcher. Professor Boudreau argued in his speech that when we purchase foreign goods, the dollars are returned to our economy, whether through capital or through investments. And so, although there is a trade deficit in goods, there's no trade deficit when you factor in the total economic flow of money in and out of the U.S. And when you gave your response, you simply restated the definition of a trade deficit. And I'm wondering if you have a response to the argument when you consider the total economic flow of money in and out of the country.
Who was that a question for? That's for me. Yeah, basically, as far as I can tell, on the pure technicality of it, minus some verbal scramblings, we're not in disagreement about the fundamentals here. It's just that I would respectfully submit that Professor Boudreau is not thinking through the fact that when you have foreign investment, that's all well and good, but it means that some foreign entity, rather than some Americans, own the asset. So yes, I would rather that a factory or an office building or some other productive asset be in existence than it not exist, but what would be even better is if it existed and belonged to us, not to them. That's my point about baselines, which also goes to his point about U.S. wealth being at an all-time high. Yeah, and it should be even higher if half of Cleveland wasn't rubble.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Fletcher, or Mr. Fletcher. You mentioned that the unemployment rate was not a good indicator of the effects of the trade, yet when Dr. Boudreau showed some slides, there was a slide that showed the earnings per hour worked continued to increase even though trade had increased, which didn't seem to support your argument. What's your response to that?
My argument, my response is pretty much the same response I've given you again, which is even if you look at something being at an all-time high or a figure that is, you know, perhaps not the worst thing in the world, because the United States is still a first world country, you're still looking about this country not being remotely where it should be. Just because average earnings are whatever they are, I would respectfully suggest you look at what those earnings are, multiply that out by a 2,000 hour year and ask whether you could live on that. Because there are definitely people in this country who are not earning what they ideally would be if this economy was run properly.
So I noticed, Mr. Fletcher, that you have been focusing a little more on how free trade has harmed producers specifically. And so my question is, Mr. Boudreau was of the opinion that free trade benefits both producers and consumers, And so I would like to ask you, if we get goods cheaper from overseas and consumers are better off, so how, under protectionism or other things, how would consumers be better off?
Okay, you got two issues there. The first thing is that if you do what I would like to see happen, which is to move the U.S. trade situation from a deficit to a balance, then you're no longer having an increase every year in how much of this country we've sold off and how much we've in effect mortgaged. So you're no longer going to have this continuing drag on our net worth, which can nevertheless increase, but it's not going to increase as much as it otherwise would. The other issue is the benefit to consumers. In order to be a consumer, you have to have a job. Okay, that's elementally obvious to everyone except economists.
There's no effect on jobs, as I showed.
As I pointed out, you're talking about people who lose $30 an hour jobs working in automobile manufacturing and end up working for $8 an hour at Walmart. The crude unemployment figures don't tell you anything.
Thank you both for being here. My question is for Mr. Fletcher. You mentioned that you'd prefer for a plant asset like a factory to be American-made. I was wondering why that matters from an economic standpoint. If foreign investment can create a plant asset like a factory that's cheaper, lasts longer, and employ people quicker, which increases output, what does it matter if it's American or not? Where's the economic incentive? Where's the economics behind it being specifically American?
Okay, you're talking about two separate issues there. The first thing is the location of the asset in America or abroad, and the second thing is the ownership of the asset, whether it belongs to an American or a foreigner. Clearly, we're better off if some plant, for example, is built. But we're also better off if that is owned by Americans, because then the value of the thing is part of our net worth, and we're better off because we collect the profits rather than someone else. As I said, it's a baseline issue. Yes, we're better off with the thing getting built, but we would be even better off if it were ours.
Let me say a word on that. Ian assumes that the amount of capital in the world is fixed. He assumes that if a foreigner owns something, then that means our capital ownership must fall. The amount of capital in the world is not fixed. Foreigners can own things, and we can own more things too. I would be better off if I owned Microsoft. There's no doubt about it. I would be better off if I owned Amazon. I would love to switch places financially with Jeff Bezos, right? Of course. But the fact that Jeff Bezos owns Amazon doesn't mean I'm worse off. And if there had been some prohibition on Jeff Bezos creating and developing Amazon, that doesn't mean that I, therefore, would have created and developed Amazon. The fact that Jeff Bezos created Amazon means that he brought his creativity to that. The world was made richer by him. I am made richer by his doing that. His doing that didn't stop me from investing in whatever ways I wanted to invest. And had he been prevented from investing, I almost surely didn't have the creativity and the gumption to do what he did. And the same thing holds true for all Americans and with respect to any foreign investment in the United States.
That's a brilliant refutation of something I didn't say. Telling me that the amount of capital in the world or in the United States is not fixed is like telling me the height of a tree is not fixed. Yes, it can grow over time, and it does, but at any given point in time, yes, the amount of capital in the world is fixed. And if you look up the figures of the IMF, you can find out, no, really, it's like a tree. It can grow. It's not fixed forever, but at any given moment in time, there is a certain amount of wealth in the world. These figures can be looked up so far as I know. They're not especially controversial. So yes, there are issues of we own something or someone else does. One doesn't have to have a zero-sum view of the world to understand there is rivalry in the world.
So you accept the Marxist view that capital grows rather automatically?
No, I have
absolutely so like the tree,
no.
It grows automatically.
That's just
capital
a metaphor.
grows not automatically. Capital grows because people productively put it to work in competitive market economies. And when you restrain their ability to compete, you reduce the amount of capital accumulation. Capital doesn't grow automatically like a tree. It grows because of human action.
I think you understand, Professor, that I'm simply using the analogy of a tree to make one simple point about something that changes over time, but at any given point has a finite size. If you want to abuse the analogy into asserting that I think capital is made of wood, I mean, you might as well, you know, do that too. The point stands.
Thank you both for being here today. So Mr. Fletcher, you mentioned a couple times today that free trade leads to the underemployment of Americans. So I'm just wondering if protectionism leads to a lessening of the real income of Americans through increased prices, how is there an economic difference between the decreased real income along with underemployment? Thank you.
You're absolutely correct that protectionism comes at a cost. That's the last thing I or anybody who knows anything about this would hush up, but I talked about it in my book, Free Trade Doesn't Work. The question is, what is that cost? Now, the first thing we can see is a lot of this extra income we think we get by having quote-unquote free, it's not free, as I said, but quote-unquote free trade, that's just selling off assets and going into debt. So if you impose a policy that makes that go away, the cost is, well, you've reduced people's ability to become poorer. So I'm not sure that that's a bad thing to get rid of. The second thing is, yes, you do have a higher cost for goods in the short run if you prevent people from just buying, you know, the cheapest product. But what you avoid thereby is you avoid the decay of America's productive capacity. You avoid the decline of our industries. I mean, I read this morning that China just got the first preliminary approval to export the C919 aircraft to the United States, which is the equivalent of a Boeing 737. Over time, given the kind of subsidies that they put behind their industries, they're quite capable of wiping out our aircraft industry. And if they can take that out, there's nothing they can't take out.